Hello class, we will be discussing the impacts of the death penalty by Marissa Pippin, Kenya Solano, William Bowie, and Jasmine Mendez. The history of the death penalty. Death sentences have been recorded back to the 5th century. It was noted that they were carried through crucifixion, drowning, beating to death, burning alive, and impalement. The death penalty, however, was influenced upon the U.S. by English settlers. Although the colonies borrowed heavily from English law and custom, none came close to replicating England's bloody code, which towards the middle of the 18th century defined over 200 offenses and capital. Instead, the early colonies typically punished a dozen or so crimes by death, ranging from murder and rape and adultery, sodomy, bestiality, and various property crimes. The first case of the death penalty dates back to the 1600s. Captain George Kendall was the first to be executed in Jamestown, Colony, Virginia, for being a spy for the Spaniards. Because of this, Virginia's Governor Sir Thomas Dale enacted the Divine Moral and Martial Laws. These laws were enacted upon for even minor offenses. Regional differences in the criminal laws and the administration surfaced from the outset in colonial America. Of particular note was the southern practice of relying on the death penalty to uphold landowners' property rights, including the selective application of capital punishment for crimes committed by blacks. U.S. death row statistics. According to a quarterly report by the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Funding, the number of prisoners on death row or facing capital retrials or resentencings across the nation was 2,504, a decrease of 24 from January 1st, 2021. It was down by 3.8% from 2,603 reported on April 1st, 2020. The convictions or death sentences of 223 death row prisoners had been reversed pending retrial, resentencing, or completion of appeal process. That left 2,281 prisoners facing active death sentences, a decrease of 25 from the previous quarter and down 3.9% from 2,373 prisoners facing active death sentence on April 1st, 2010. 34.4% of those on U.S. death row were in states with moratorium on executions, a decrease of 6 from the previous quarter that left 1,468 prisoners in 25 states, or 58.6% of death row, with death sentences LDF classified as active and enforceable. Innocent people on death row. According to a study made by the National Academy of Sciences, 4.1 inmates on death row are actually innocent. The article Rate of False Conviction of Criminal Defendants Who Are Sentenced to Death illustrates that the number of innocent people is likely more than double at the number of those actually exonerated and free from death row. According to the chart, out of all the innocent people on death row, only 12.6% have been executed, 4.0% have died on death row but not executed, 46.1% are still on death row, 35.8% have been removed from death row but not exonerated, 1.6% were exonerated, 1.4% were exonerated under threat of execution, and only 0.1% were exonerated but not under the threat of execution. Juveniles on death row. Since 1973, 226 juvenile death sentences have been imposed. 22 juvenile offenders have been executed and 82 remain on death row. The execution of a juvenile is one of the most controversial topics, especially because studies prove that juveniles cannot entirely be held accountable at the same extent as adults. Brains aren't fully developed until around the age of 18, which is why juveniles make impulsive decisions and bad judgment calls. Another factor that affects juveniles' impulsivity is their environment. Adolescence is a transitional period, a time of significant change when cognitive abilities, emotions, judgment, impulsive control, identity, and even the brain itself are still developing. Extenuating circumstances may further compound this immaturity. A high percentage of juveniles on death row have suffered from all or a combination of the following factors: mental abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, drug addiction, abandonment, and severe poverty.
In colonial America, many offenses were punishable by death. Methods of execution, such as differing severity and treatment of the body after death, recognized gradations of guilt. Execution was highly public and was regarded as a function performed by the people and the community. Farrell, 2002. Back then, crime was considered the act of free will, and not punishing this behavior was regarded as a failure to the community. As time progressed, questions about the deterrence value grew as public awareness of execution diminished, since those at whom deterrence was directed had only second-hand knowledge of an execution. Farrell, 2002. Imprisonment of the convicted became a more practical alternative, as many argued that being imprisoned was a greater deterrence than death. The certainty of punishment, rather than the severity of it, was a much greater discouragement. As we reach current times, On paper, the death penalty is potentially applicable to many crimes, but in practice, is it imposed relatively rarely and then only after prolonged litigation. Farrell, 2002. In 1972, the case of Furman v. Georgia brought to light that the act of capital punishment was unconstitutional in violation with the 8th and 14th Amendments. Never before had the Supreme Court ruled the death penalty as unconstitutional. The death penalty was not used in a consistent fashion across a variety of cases, and the racial discrimination surrounding the death penalty only furthered the argument of unconstitution. This led to the court reaching a decision of ceasing all death sentences pending at the time and reducing them to life imprisonment sentences. The ceasing of death sentences opened the doors for states to rewrite their death penalty statutes to eliminate the problems mentioned in Furman v. Georgia. To address the concerns that emerged from the question of whether or not capital punishment was constitutional, some states created guidelines for the judge and the jury to refer to. These new guided discretion statutes were approved by the Supreme Court in 1972 during the trial of Gregg v. Georgia, reinstating that the death penalty was constitutional under certain terms. From 1977 until now, there have been a total of 1,534 executions that have taken place. Capital punishment is authorized in 27 states by the federal government and the U.S. military. In recent years, New Mexico, in 2009, Illinois, 2011, Connecticut, 2012, Maryland, 2013, New Hampshire, 2019, Colorado, 2020, and Virginia, 2021, have all abolished the death penalty, replacing it with a sentence of life imprisonment with no possibility for parole. McLean's, 2021.
The death penalty in California. From 1978 to 2000, over 700 inmates have been sentenced to death. However, only 13 have been executed. In those 22 years, the death row cost was over $4 billion. This has caused an uproar because people believe that it is a waste of money to have inmates waiting decades to be put to death. The same goes for those inmates who die of natural causes while on death row or commit suicide. Proposition 34 was introduced in 2012 to repeal the death penalty. However, it did not pass. The reason it did not pass is because the majority voted to keep it. However, it was later found out that Prop 34 was not for the moralistic or based on the risk of executing the innocent, but instead it was based on economics and money. 4 years later, in 2016, Proposition 62 came back for the repeal of the death penalty. And again, it did not pass because the majority wanted to keep it. Aftermath of Prop 62 led Governor Newsom to signing a moratorium, which is a temporary prohibition of an activity, in March of 2019. Newsom stated that the intentional killing of another person is wrong, and as governor, I will not oversee the execution of any individual. Our death penalty system has been, by all measure, a failure. It has discriminated against defendants who are mentally ill, black or brown, or can't afford expensive legal representation. It has provided no public safety benefit or value as a deterrent. It has wasted billions of taxpayers' dollars. Most of all, the death penalty is absolute. It's irreversible and irreparable in the event of human error. President Donald Trump fired back, saying, defying voters, the governor of California will halt all death penalty execution of 737 stone-cold killers. Friends and families of the always forgotten victims are not thrilled, and neither am I. Controversy, ethics, and morals. Many believe that the death penalty violates the 8th Amendment. In 2014, U.S. District Judge Cormac Carney ruled California's death penalty unconstitutional because the delays over executions violate the ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Many argue that inmates with a life sentence and no possibility of parole are already facing a hard punishment, And the death penalty is a cruel punishment because an inmate knowingly waits to die for decades. Food for thought. Would it not be a cruel punishment if the execution date came much sooner? In California, the death penalty uses some variation of the aggravating factor, guided discretion approach. This means that brutal or aggravated homicides qualify for the death penalty, while other capital crimes do not. Religious people and others who share the same morals believe that two wrongs don't make a right, or they believe that God is the only one that can take a life. Victims' families, on the other hand, are not so generous. A mother of a victim of a 1993 case gave an impact statement and showed the jury a 20-minute video of her daughter. The accused was sentenced to death. Again, in 1991, Jervis Payne murdered a mother and her 2-year-old daughter. Again, because of the height of emotion, he was sentenced to death. After this case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the decision to impose a death sentence must be, or appear to be, based on reason rather than caprice or emotion.
Another impact of the death penalty is mental health of death row inmates. Many inmates from death row suffer from anxiety and depression. Some inmates commit suicide before their sentence. They have limited access to friends and family, and their freedoms are even more limited compared to the people who are in state prisons since they are under constant surveillance. Suicide on death row. A study by Territo and Lester showed that for the years 1978 through 2010, suicide rates on death row were higher than that for the general population of males over the age of 15 and for the state prisons for all but 2 years. The mean suicide death rate between 1978 through 2010 was 129.7 per 100,000 inmates a year. Suicide doesn't happen too often, but it still happens. Is the death penalty a deterrent? Yes and no. Some studies suggest that they do have an effect, but some criminologists say it doesn't have an effect. According to GIST, death penalty states that had at least one execution in a given year had murder rates that were 28% lower. There was a model in Texas that showed from January 1994 to December 2005, in the first and 4 months that followed an execution, there was 2.5 fewer homicides. Arguments that say the death penalty isn't a deterrent. There was a national survey from leading criminologists in 2004 that saw that 64% said that the death penalty wasn't a deterrent. Most of the criminologists don't think that deterrence and death penalty really correlate. Only 10% believe that they do correlate, and in some instances, some psychopath murderers could see the death penalty as motivation. In conclusion, the death penalty is very controversial. It impacts many people's lives, whether it be economically, social, or politically.